The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. A man's life, simple, ordinary, and terrible, because it was false. This is the story of Ivan Ilyich, a respectable judge who lived as society expected, dutiful, polite, and proper. Yet when death knocks on his door, he discovers the horrifying truth. He has never truly lived. In his final moments, stripped of status and comfort, Tolstoy forces us to confront the question, what does it mean to live a genuine life before death makes all illusions crumble? The news of death. It was in the rooms of the Court of Justice, during an interval in the case, that the members first learned of Ivan Ilyich's death. The news spread quietly at first, like a whisper moving through paper walls, until it reached every desk and every well-polished pair of boots in the room. Each man expressed, in words and gesture, that sense of decorous regret which custom demands of civilized people. But behind every solemn face there flickered another thought, the inevitable question of how this death might affect his own position. Among the first to hear was Peter Ivanovich, a longtime colleague and, in the ordinary sense of the word, a friend of the deceased. As soon as he read the brief announcement in the Gazette that Ivan Ilyich Golovin, member of the Court of Justice, had died after a short illness, his mind, without his willing it, ran immediately to the advantages which might follow. He has died, Peter thought, so Fedorov may be moved up, and that means my promotion is nearer. It was not cynicism exactly. It was simply the normal arithmetic of a career that had long trained itself to such reckonings. Yet, with this practical reflection came also a faint memory of duty. A man must appear properly affected. One must visit the widow. And so that evening, Peter Ivanovich dressed himself in his black frock coat, assumed a suitable expression of gravity, and took a carriage to the house of the late Ivan Ilyich. The hallway of the Golovin home was crowded. The faint smell of incense mingled awkwardly with the odor of fresh varnish, for the drawing room had been newly decorated not long before Ivan Ilyich's illness. A dim light burned in the parlor where the coffin lay. When Peter entered, he saw at once the familiar figure of his former colleague, now transformed into a waxen likeness of himself, stretched out in a black frock coat, as if still preparing to attend court. On the face there rested that peculiar expression so often seen on the dead, a reproach to the living, as though to say, "What have you done to me?" And at the same time, "It will happen to you as well." Peter crossed himself hastily, bowed, and, looking again at the lifeless figure, felt at once a tightening in his throat and an obscure sense of relief. There he is, and it is he who is dead, not I. The thought was involuntary, shameful, yet strangely consoling. Moving aside, Peter noticed the widow, Praskovya Fedorovna, seated on a low chair near the door. Her expression combined the studied grief of a bereaved spouse with the faint anxiety of one managing an awkward household affair. She greeted him in whispers, led him into the adjoining room, and began at once to discuss the practical details, the doctor's expenses, the insurance, the pension. Even in her mourning, her eyes betrayed calculation. Life must go on, and there were forms to be observed, signatures to be obtained, documents to be prepared. When Peter emerged again among the guests, the air of constraint had softened. The men spoke in low tones of recent transfers, of the minister's health, of the quality of the new examining magistrate. Someone even told a mild joke. Each felt vaguely that to linger too long beside the coffin was improper, even dangerous. One must show respect, but not invite reflection. Later that night, as Peter returned home, he felt for the first time the curious discomfort that comes when the mask of daily life slips just a little. He tried to imagine what it would be like if death had come for him instead of Ivan Ilyich, the preparations, the lying still, the black frock coat buttoned over his lifeless chest. But almost at once he dismissed the thought. Such things happen to others, not oneself. One goes on living, dining, reading the papers, attending court, until, somehow, it is one's own name that appears in the Gazette. Thus did the life of Ivan Ilyich end, and with it begins the true story of his death.
The life of Ivan Ilyich. Ivan Ilyич's life had been, in every outward respect, the most ordinary and therefore the most terrible. He was a member of that class which, though outwardly distinguished, lives by the decorum of habit rather than the truth of conviction. He was neither cruel nor kind, neither stupid nor particularly intelligent. He was exactly what society required him to be, an intelligent, polished, agreeable man, who knew how to perform his duties and to maintain appearances. From his earliest youth, Ivan Ilyich had conformed instinctively to that code of propriety which governs the lives of well-bred people. He had been, at school, exactly the kind of boy the teachers praise and the classmates respect. Cheerful, capable, even-tempered, yet always a little apart. He had never gone to extremes, never lost control, never yielded to what is improper. Everything spontaneous in him had been trained to silence. He studied law, entered government service, and quickly understood what was demanded of him. Not brilliance, but tact. Not depth, but correctness. In those early years, his career advanced smoothly. He knew how to make himself agreeable to superiors without servility, how to maintain cordial relations with equals, and how to keep inferiors at a proper distance. His life, as he himself might have described it, proceeded pleasantly. There were dinners, visits, card games, laughter. There was ambition, but always of the respectable kind. It was at this time that he met Praskovya Fedorovna. She was a pretty, well-connected young woman with a small dowry and a large sense of propriety. Ivan Ilyich decided that she was the sort of wife a man of his position ought to have. The early days of their marriage were agreeable enough, but before long he discovered that married life, like official life, had its unpleasant sides. Praskovya was quick-tempered, exacting, and inclined to complain. To escape her irritations, Ivan threw himself into his work. The work became his refuge. When at home, he sought comfort in the routines of dinner, bridge, and social visits. What others called his family life became merely another part of the general decorum of his existence. Children were born. Some died, some lived. His career advanced. He moved from one province to another, always rising in rank, always earning the approval of his superiors. Each new appointment filled him with the same quiet satisfaction. He had done things as they ought to be done. When he looked around him, he saw men who had failed, men who had been indiscreet, intemperate, or foolish, and he congratulated himself that he was not like them. In all this, there was no malice, no conscious hypocrisy. It was simply that Ivan Ilyich lived as the majority live, guided by the opinions of others, never pausing to ask what those opinions were worth. He thought himself perfectly happy, and indeed there was nothing to disturb his serenity until he reached middle age. Then came a period of trouble. His position in the ministry was threatened by a reorganization. The possibility of being passed over filled him with a sense of injury. For the first time, life seemed uncertain. After several anxious months, he obtained, through influence, a more advantageous post in another city.
The relief was immense. He told his friends that this was a most happy coincidence, though in truth he had labored secretly to secure it. Praskovia shared his delight, not because she cared for his career, but because the new appointment meant a higher salary and a larger house. The house became their chief concern. Ivan Ilyich devoted himself to its decoration with the same seriousness he brought to his office. He selected curtains, ordered furniture, consulted upholsterers, all with the careful eye of one performing a duty. Each object, each arrangement, gave him the peculiar pleasure of knowing that it was exactly what well-bred people have. When the house was complete, he invited friends to admire it. They praised the taste, the elegance, the propriety of every detail. Ivan Ilyich felt that he had at last attained what life was meant to be: comfort, respectability, order. Everything was just as it should be. But it was at this very moment, when his life seemed most secure, when every room in his new home reflected his idea of propriety, that something invisible shifted. A small accident, trivial at first, occurred while he was showing a decorator how he wanted the draperies hung. He missed his footing, struck his side against a window latch, and felt a brief, sharp pain. He thought little of it then. He was far too absorbed in the delight of his new surroundings. That pain, unnoticed and disregarded, was the first sign, the faint knock of something vast and implacable that had already begun its approach. Thus, without awareness or warning, the long, slow catastrophe began. The illness begins. Not long after the move, Ivan Ilyich began to notice a peculiar discomfort in his left side, a dull, persistent ache that seemed, at first, no more than a nuisance. He continued his duties at court, dined with colleagues, and played bridge in the evenings as usual. The pain was irregular, sometimes sharp, sometimes fading altogether. But gradually it became a shadow that followed him through every hour of his day. He went to a doctor, one of the most distinguished specialists of the city. The visit itself was conducted with all the solemn ceremony of official procedure. The doctor assumed the same tone Ivan Ilyich himself used when examining witnesses. There was a look of professional superiority, a measured politeness, and an undertone of weary irritation that said, "Please do not interfere with my process." The examination was long, technical, and inconclusive. One word was used, then another, Latin replacing Latin. Ivan Ilyich felt that the essential point, the pain itself, was somehow lost beneath the tide of phrases. Finally, the doctor looked grave, recommended further observation, and suggested that Ivan adopt a more regular mode of life. The verdict, though vague, disturbed him deeply. When he returned home, he tried to repeat the doctor's words to his wife, but she seized only upon the part that promised recovery. "Of course it's nothing serious," she said, adjusting the lace at her sleeve. "You always imagined the worst. The doctor said you only need to be careful." Yet the pain continued. It did not grow, it did not fade, it merely persisted. And with persistence came a new kind of fear, not of death yet, but of uncertainty, of that invisible disorder within the body that mocks all reason. In the weeks that followed, Ivan Ilyich visited other physicians. Each one treated him with the same air of professional superiority, as if to say, "You must not doubt me, for I alone understand." They used different words, prescribed different medicines, but all with the same manner, the tone of men discussing a case, not a person. Ivan began to notice that what mattered to each was not his suffering, but the degree to which his symptoms confirmed their theories. One doctor declared that the trouble was in the appendix, another in the kidney, a third in the intestines. They disagreed courteously, yet completely, and through all these polite discussions, Ivan Ilyich's life, the only thing truly at stake, continued to slip away quietly. There was, too, another kind of torment, that of those around him. Praskovia's concern was mingled with annoyance. She could not forgive him for disturbing the smooth current of their domestic life. Her sympathy was dutiful rather than affectionate. When will this end, she often thought, not daring to say it aloud. It is always the same complaint, the same face. At the office, his colleagues inquired after his health with polite indifference. Beneath their words, he could sense the impatience of men eager to return to business. They pitied him only as one pities someone whose misfortune interrupts one's own convenience. And Ivan Ilyich himself, seeing their coolness, began to suspect something monstrous, that the world had no place for the reality of his suffering. His illness had stripped him of his role, the judge, the gentleman, the social being, and what remained seemed invisible to others. They saw only the mask that habit had made, not the face beneath it. He became irritable. Every small noise, every whisper of laughter wounded him. He scolded his servants, quarreled with his wife, and then, ashamed, withdrew into silence. At night, when the pain woke him, he would lie motionless in the dark, listening to the faint ticking of the clock. The sound, once comforting, now seemed to mock him, measuring the slow approach of something he could not name. In those sleepless hours, his thoughts turned inward. What if it is something serious, he would ask himself. But surely it cannot be. It cannot happen to me. I have lived as one ought to live. Then, as if to prove this to himself, he would recall the correctness of his conduct, the decorum of his life, his success in the eyes of others. Yet beneath these memories lurked a quiet voice that whispered, "Yes, but what if all this has been wrong?" He silenced that voice at once. He avoided every thought that led beyond the surface of things. He continued to attend court, though even there the papers blurred before his eyes. He felt that his colleagues looked at him with pity, or worse, with relief. As weeks turned to months, the pain grew sharper. Eating became difficult. Sleep became rare. He felt a dull heaviness spreading through his body, a sense of inward decay. Sometimes he imagined that death was already within him, sitting silently, waiting for the final moment to reveal itself. He began to notice that others too avoided him. There was something in his eyes, a desperate questioning, that made people uncomfortable. They wanted the conversation to remain polite, the atmosphere undisturbed. When he mentioned his illness, they would say, "Ah, yes, we all have our troubles," and quickly change the subject. It was then that Ivan Ilyich realized with a kind of cold astonishment that no one, not even the doctors, cared for what was really happening to him. They all spoke of the case, of the diagnosis, but not of death. It was as though death were indecent, an impropriety not to be mentioned in good society. Thus the weeks passed. The outer forms of his life remained, the dinners, the visits, the polite talk, but all seemed hollow, unreal. He had once believed that the life of a respectable man was solid, secure, substantial. Now he saw that it was a thin crust, and beneath it yawned an abyss. And still, the pain went on.
The denial and the isolation. With every passing week, the pain grew more insistent, and with it came the realization, faint at first, then terrifyingly clear, that his illness was not a trivial thing, nor one from which he might recover. Yet even as this truth began to press upon him, Ivan Ilyich resisted it.
He fought not against the pain, but against the knowledge it brought. His whole life had been built on the assumption that things happen as they ought, that he was a man who lived correctly, therefore would die correctly, quietly, naturally, decently, like other respectable people. But here was something that refused to obey the rules. At first, he sought to reason with himself. Doctors differ, he would think. Some say the appendix, others the kidney. It is confusion, that is all. One of them must be right. I shall recover. But beneath that voice of reason, another began to whisper, "No, they are all deceiving you, as you have deceived yourself. It is not the kidney, nor the appendix. It is death." He could not bear that thought. He drove it away with anger and noise. He grew irritable with his wife, scolded his daughter, and snapped at the servants. Then, ashamed, he would retreat into his study, sink into his chair, and stare blankly at the wall. The world he had lived in, of dinners, social calls, legal cases, and polite laughter, continued to exist around him, but now it seemed grotesque. He could see it for what it was, a grand play in which everyone pretended not to see the one truth waiting behind the curtain. Even his own family played their parts dutifully. Praskovya spoke of doctors and cures, but in her eyes Ivan saw something else: irritation. His illness had spoiled her comfortable routine. "What a burden you have become," that glance seemed to say, though her words were tender. Their friends came to visit less often. At first they had come out of duty, bringing flowers, polite phrases, and the faint odor of expensive cologne. But the sight of Ivan's gray, hollow face frightened them. He had become a mirror in which they could glimpse their own future. So they avoided him, or came only for a few minutes, speaking cheerfully of theater, politics, and gossip, until they could make a graceful exit. Ivan noticed this, and it filled him with bitterness. He saw through every gesture, every smile, every word of comfort. They all pretended not to know what he knew. He was dying, and none of them dared to say it. At night, when the house was silent, he would lie awake, staring into the dark. He feared the quiet most of all, for in it the truth grew enormous. Sometimes he would turn on the lamp, reach for the Bible, and try to read, but the words blurred before his eyes. He would murmur half aloud, "Lord, help me," though he was not sure to whom he spoke. His wife suggested that a famous foreign doctor be consulted. The idea gave her hope, not because she believed in the cure, but because it gave her something to do. A new doctor meant new visits, new discussions, a renewal of the social routine she understood so well. But to Ivan, these visits became a torment. Each time he sat before a new physician, he recognized in the man's tone the same dreadful arrogance, the voice of one who treats life as a theory. He began to feel that the entire medical world was engaged in a conspiracy to deny what was plain, that he was dying, and that nothing could stop it. When he tried to speak of this truth to Praskovya, she frowned as though offended by his lack of decorum. "You always exaggerate. People do recover from such things. Think positively." He turned away, too weary to argue. From that day on, he ceased to speak of his illness to anyone. He withdrew into himself, avoiding both pity and pretense. He continued to go to court, though even there the faces of his colleagues seemed suddenly cruel. When they spoke of minor legal matters, their voices sounded empty, absurd. He felt like a man who, condemned to die, listens to others discussing the theater. Gradually, the outer world receded. Only the pain remained, constant, faithful, unrelenting. It became, in a strange way, his sole companion, the one presence that did not lie to him. It reminded him every moment that he was dying. And yet, he still refused to say the word. When the thought came, "It is death," he drove it away. "It cannot be. Not I. I am Ivan Ilyich. I have lived correctly. Others die, not I." But a time came when that lie no longer worked. He looked into the mirror one morning and saw a stranger, a pale, wasted face, eyes filled with fear. The sight filled him with horror. He tried to smile, to adjust his collar, to appear as before, but the smile came crooked and false. In that moment, he understood what no doctor had told him. Yes, it is you. You are dying. He turned from the mirror, trembling. For the first time in his life, Ivan Ilyich, the correct, well-mannered, proper man, cried. He cried not from the pain, but from the terror of seeing his whole life revealed as a terrible mistake.
Gerasim and the Awakening. The days and nights began to merge into one long shadow. Pain had become Ivan Ilyich's constant companion, a silent, gnawing thing that left him half-conscious, suspended between sleep and delirium. The only relief he found came from the young servant Gerasim, a tall, strong peasant with clear eyes and a quiet heart. It was Gerasim who brought the light of simple honesty into the suffocating darkness of Ivan's home. When others tiptoed around the truth, when his wife spoke in soft, artificial tones, or when the doctor made confident promises that meant nothing, Gerasim did not pretend. He alone accepted what was happening. "Yes, sir," he said one evening, holding Ivan's legs to ease the pressure. "We shall all die someday. It's God's will. Why be afraid?" There was no coldness in his voice, only kindness, the calm certainty of a man who lived close to the earth, who understood life and death without words. And in that simple acceptance, Ivan felt something he had not known for months: comfort. Gerasim did not fear him, did not lie, did not shrink from the unpleasant task. He carried out his duties, emptying the basin, adjusting the cushions, massaging the swollen feet with cheerful willingness. When Ivan would apologize for troubling him, Gerasim would smile and say, "It's nothing, sir. It's for you, for one who is ill. I too shall be like this someday." That one phrase pierced Ivan's heart more deeply than any sermon. "I too shall be like this someday." There was no coldness in it, no pity, no condescension, only truth. For the first time, Ivan felt the presence of a human soul unafraid to face reality. He began to wait for Gerasim's visits. When Gerasim was in the room, the pain seemed lighter, the hours shorter. The young man's healthy body, his patient hands, and his serene face reminded Ivan of what he had lost: simplicity, sincerity, and peace. In his presence, the fear of death receded a little, replaced by something new, the faint, tremulous sense that there was still goodness in the world. The rest of the household, however, remained absorbed in the theater of pretense. Praskovia had grown more distant, more aggrieved. She treated her husband's illness as an inconvenience, something embarrassing, like a social faux pas that must be managed with tact. She would enter the room softly, ask perfunctory questions, like, "How are you now, dear?" and, receiving the expected reply, would leave to complain to friends about the strain of caring for a sick man.
their daughter, recently engaged, found the situation distasteful. She avoided her father's room whenever possible. The sight of him filled her with the same uneasy dread others felt, not compassion, but discomfort. Only Gerasim came willingly. Sometimes he would sit quietly by the bedside, peeling an apple or polishing a boot, humming softly. The simple rhythm of his movements soothed Ivan more than any medicine. There was in Gerasim's every act the unspoken message: to live is to serve, to love, to accept. He began to think about this young man's life, so plain, so unpretentious, yet filled with a sense of rightness that his own had never known. He, Ivan Ilyich, had lived for propriety, for respect, for the judgment of others. And here was a peasant, uneducated and humble, who lived for something truer, a quiet harmony with the world and with himself. It was an astonishing discovery. He began to see that the peace he envied in Gerasim was not given by youth or strength, but by honesty. Gerasim feared neither work nor death because he deceived neither himself nor others. He did not measure life by appearances. He lived it as it was. One night, Ivan awoke after a few moments of restless sleep. The pain was worse than ever. He cried out, and Gerasim came at once, lifted his legs and held them on his knees. Ivan felt the relief instantly. He looked up at the young man's calm face, at his steady hands, and at the unself-conscious tenderness in his movements, and something broke within him. "Forgive me," Ivan whispered, tears filling his eyes. "For what, sir?" Gerasim asked gently. "For making you suffer with me." Gerasim smiled faintly. "It's God's work, sir. You suffer now, but all will be well soon." Ivan could not answer. He turned his face to the wall and wept, but not from pain. These were not the bitter, angry tears of fear. They were softer, almost grateful. Something within him was changing. He began to feel that perhaps he had lived wrongly, that all those years of propriety and correctness had been spent avoiding what was most real. He thought of his youth, of the moments when he had felt true joy, the smell of early morning air on the river, the laughter of his first friends at school, the sense of goodness that once seemed natural and effortless. Where had that gone? When had life become this long performance? The thought filled him with both sadness and clarity. He now saw that every ambition, every formality, every carefully chosen phrase, all of it had been a mask. He had lived for the judgment of others, not for truth. And as he realized this, the pain that gripped his body seemed to merge with the pain of his conscience. They were one and the same, the body decaying and the soul awakening. Each night, Gerasim would come and hold his legs. Each night, Ivan would feel the strange mixture of pain and peace. He began to dread the daylight when others returned with their false cheer and empty talk, and to long for the nights when only truth and silence remained. It was during one of those nights that a new thought entered his mind, faint, like the first glimmer of dawn. Perhaps I have lived as I ought, but if so, what is the right way? He did not yet know the answer, but for the first time he had asked the question.
The final agony. The question that had arisen in Ivan Ilyich's mind, "What if my whole life has been wrong?" did not leave him again. It grew clearer, heavier, more insistent with every passing day.
He tried to dismiss it as he had dismissed all unpleasant thoughts in the past, by recalling his success, his propriety, the approval of society. But the thought no longer obeyed him. It clung to him, burning like a coal within the hollowness of his chest. He began to see his life as a smooth, polished surface, beautiful to the eye, but hollow underneath. Everything that he had once called good now seemed false. He remembered the early years of his marriage, his endless concern with respectability, the way he had bent his nature to fit the expectations of others. He had lived not for himself, not even for God, but for what was considered proper. And now, when all that remained was death, propriety was meaningless. He saw through the masks. His wife's anxious tenderness, his colleagues' polite concern, the doctor's solemn indifference, all were part of the same lie. He was surrounded by deceit, deceit that no one acknowledged, yet everyone served. They pretended that he was not dying, that everything was going as it should, and that soon he would recover. But he knew the truth. He was dying, and they knew it too. Only Gerasim did not lie. "Why do they all torment me?" Ivan thought one evening, as Praskovya tiptoed out after her nightly visit. "Why do they force me to pretend? Why can't they see that their lies make my suffering unbearable?" The pain, physical and spiritual, had become continuous. It never ceased, only rose and fell like a tide. But worse than the pain was the fear, the cold, unrelenting certainty that his life was ending and that he was not ready. He was terrified not of what awaited him, but of the realization that his life had been lived wrongly, that all his striving had been for nothing. For 3 days he screamed. He screamed not from the pain of his body, but from the pain of his soul. The cry rose from deep within him, wild, unending, desperate. "It's not possible," he shouted again and again. "I cannot have lived as I ought." But another voice within him, calm, merciless, undeniable, answered, "Yes, you did not live as you ought, but you can still make it right." "How?" he cried inwardly. "How can I make it right when my life is gone?" There was no answer, only darkness, the slow ticking of the clock, the faint rustle of the curtains, and his own ragged breath. Time had become his enemy. Every moment brought him closer to the void, and he could find no refuge, not in religion, not in memory, not in reason. At times he tried to cling to his old faith. He repeated prayers he had learned as a child, but the words came out hollow, mechanical, like a language he no longer understood. He longed for something real, something pure, but found only the emptiness of habit. Then one evening, as he lay in half-conscious torment, he heard his son's quiet sob. The boy had creeped into the room unnoticed, and now stood at his bedside, holding his father's thin hand to his face, weeping. When Ivan opened his eyes and saw him, a strange warmth pierced through the pain. Not pity for himself, but pity for the boy. For the first time in months, he felt love, simple, unselfish love. At that moment, his wife came in, her face pale and frightened. She asked, "What is it, Ivan Ilyich? What do you want?" He looked at her, at the worn, anxious face that had once been so familiar, and felt the same pity, the same tenderness. He wanted to say, "Forgive me, forgive us both, we did not know how to live." But all he could whisper was, "Let him go. He will be sorry for me. It's better if he goes." Praskovya burst into tears and left the room with her son. And as they went, Ivan felt something loosen inside him, as though the knot that had bound his heart began to uncoil. He realized that all his fear, all his anger had come from his refusal to admit the truth. He had lived for himself, for appearances, for pride. But now, seeing their tears, he felt what he had never felt before, compassion. And with compassion came a sense of release. He turned his thoughts inward again. Where is it, he asked himself? Where is the pain? Where is death? He searched for it and could not find it. Instead, he felt something else, a light, not outside, but within. It grew brighter and brighter, filling him with peace. Someone said, "It's over." He wanted to say, "No, not over, but beginning." He drew in one last breath, sighed deeply, and said, "So that's it. What joy!" He stretched out his body, fell back, and died. The epilogue. The light beyond. The house was quiet. The curtains were drawn, and a faint scent of incense lingered in the still air. Praskovya Fedorovna sat in the drawing room with the doctor and her sister, speaking in low voices about funeral arrangements, pensions, and the inconveniences of widowhood. Her eyes were red, but her tone was measured, composed. The tragedy, she felt, had been endured, decently, properly, without scandal. In the adjoining room, Ivan Ilyich's body lay motionless in the coffin, his face strangely calm. It no longer bore the marks of suffering or fear. The expression was different, quiet, resolute, even joyful, as if he had discovered something they could not understand. When Pyotr Ivanovich came to pay his respects, he looked upon his friend's face and was struck by the serenity of it. There was something in that lifeless countenance that seemed to say, "All that you fear, all that you cling to, is nothing. Only truth remains." Pyotr crossed himself hastily and turned away. He felt a momentary unease, not grief, but the unsettling sense that Ivan had reached some knowledge beyond his grasp. Later, when the funeral was over, when the guests had murmured their condolences and left, life resumed its ordinary rhythm. Praskovya began calculating what her widow's pension would amount to. Her daughter spoke of her upcoming wedding. Colleagues discussed the vacant position Ivan's death had left open. Everything continued just as it always had. The same hollow propriety that had ruled Ivan's life now surrounded his death. But something remained, invisible, unspeakable, in the quiet space where his body had lain. For though they did not understand it, Ivan Ilyich had not died as they expected. He had discovered in the moment of death what he had failed to find in life, the peace that comes from truth. He had lived for appearances and suffered. He had denied death and feared it. But when he stopped resisting, when he pitied others instead of himself, the fear vanished, and death itself was revealed as an illusion. In his last instant, he saw that what he called life was not real life, that true life begins when one ceases to live for oneself. It was this realization, this surrender, that filled him with the radiance his face now bore. No one in that household could have explained it, but had Gerasim been asked, he might have said quietly, "He found what we all must find, God's truth. It's hard at first, but then it's easy. He went where we all go, only he went rightly." Outside, the sun was shining. The city's indifferent noise went on, carriages rolling, people hurrying, laughter echoing in the street. Life continued, shallow and self-absorbed, as though nothing had happened. But far beyond that small world of manners and fear, something vast and tender opened its arms to receive him. He had fallen into death and found that it was not darkness, but light. The terror had vanished, the pain dissolved. In its place was the quiet certainty that there is no death, only the end of falsehood and the beginning of truth. And so what all men feared, Ivan Ilyich had embraced. What all men denied, he had understood. He had lived wrongly, but he had died rightly. And that, in Tolstoy's world, was salvation.